Welcome to Innovation Inside the Box. Drew Boyd teaches teams, businesses, and governments how to solve tough problems to create a culture of innovation and a flowing pipeline. Innovation Inside the Box features structured creativity and innovation strategies for leaders who want to think differently, be more innovative, implement change, and grow. The conversations you'll hear will help you apply innovation methods to services and processes, overcome resistance to ideas, and create a culture of innovation. Here's your host, Drew Boyd.
I have two challenges for you in this episode. One challenge is going to be fairly easy, and one challenge is going to be fairly hard. Of course, I'm not going to tell you which one is easy and which one is hard, because I'm going to want you to figure that out. I'm going to challenge you to take an everyday item that I'll specify for you, and you're going to be challenged to find an example of a creative pattern in that everyday thing. The second challenge is going to be to take that everyday thing and create something completely new to the world. Invent something that you've never seen before. Which of those two do you think is going to be easy and which one is hard? Hey, if you're like most people, you probably think inventing something completely new to the world, that's got to be the hardest one. But in this episode, I hope to convince you that the opposite is true. That in fact, inventing something is easier, much easier than you think. That is the whole point of this podcast, Innovation Inside the Box. The idea that you can be creative no matter where you're starting from in the creativity scale. So stay tuned. Let's see if that is the way it pans out for you. Okay, we're going to take an everyday item. In this case, what I want you to do is have in mind an everyday camera. If you own a camera, many people don't have a camera. They have instead the camera function on their smartphones, and that's fine too. You can just take the camera function. It's that thing that you snap pictures on. And I'm willing to bet, if you're like me and like most people, you use that function, if not every day, certainly every week. You're taking a picture of something. It's a handy feature to have. If you're in the airport in a parking lot and you want to remember where you parked, I know I do this. You take a picture of it. It could be a picture of one of your children or your grandpuppy in my case, or something else that you want to retain the memory of it. Okay, so the first challenge is this. I'm going to describe an innovation pattern, and then you have the task of seeing if you can see this pattern in an everyday camera. You're going to find that this is not as hard as you think. But let's work through it because, as it turns out, cameras have this particular pattern in many, many ways. The pattern we're going to talk about today is multiplication. It's one of the 5 patterns of the creativity method called SIT for short, which stands for Systematic Inventive Thinking. And if you're a regular listener to the podcast, you know that this method is something you can use to become more creative no matter where you're starting from in the creativity scale. 5 patterns explain most innovations in the world. 5 patterns have been used by mankind for thousands of years to invent new things. The pattern we're going to talk about today is called multiplication. You take a component of something, in this case a camera, you imagine creating a copy of it, but then change the copy. The way multiplication works is you make a copy or copies of it, but then that copy has to be different in some qualitative way. Its function, its location, its color, I don't know. Now, it turns out that cameras have a lot of multiplication in it. It started with a core idea, but then it continued to evolve and improve through time. In fact, it may surprise you to learn that one pattern, multiplication, formed the entire premise of all photography. Think about it. What is a photograph, after all? A photograph, if you know the physics of it or the optics of it, is when light emerges through a tiny pinhole and shines the image behind it in reverse form. And this was discovered years ago, how you can replicate an image of something by shining the light of it through a pinhole. It flips it upside down, and voila, you have photographed that item. And when you place that photograph on something like sensitive photographic paper or a light screen or something like that, you essentially have copied it. The entire world of photography is based on the multiplication pattern. Now, here's what's interesting is that over time, that camera, that photographic idea has added features using the multiplication pattern over and over. And I want you to think about it for a minute. Let me point out probably one of the most interesting ones. It's a feature called red eye reduction. Now, red eye is that phenomena where you take a picture of somebody, and when you look at the picture afterwards, you notice that the subject has red, eerie eyes, like demon eyes. And this happens not just with humans, but it also happens with pets. Do you know what that is, red eye? Red eye is when the light from the flash goes into the eyeball, hits the back of the eyeball, and bounces back out, but it picks up the color of the blood supply in the back of your eyeball, and then hits back into the camera, and it's captured in the image. And voila, you see this person with eerie red eyes. Well, a very smart guy at a company called Vivitar, Robert McKay, I believe was his name, invented a way to eliminate that using multiplication. And what it is, and I'm sure you've seen this when you flash your camera, you know how it flashes more than once? It does the initial flash just to get your eyeball to dilate a little bit, not to dilate, to constrict. Got it backwards there. The pupil restricts, and that restricts the amount of light that can get into your eyeball. The rest of your body gets lit up, but the light from the first flash can't get through that, or from the second flash can't get through that. The first flash closes the eyeball, the second flash then illuminates the subject, and there you go. No more red eye. So a simple example of multiplication. Now just about every camera out there uses this simple idea, this simple innovation based on multiplication. All right, take a look now at your camera and see if you can see something related to viewfinders. Viewfinders. Many cameras today have multiple viewfinders. They have the viewfinder where you stick your eye up to it to look and see the subject. Hey, but a lot of cameras now have an LCD version. You flip out a little panel and you'll see another way to visualize the subject. Some cameras now have the viewfinder in the front and the back, which is great. If you think about the smartphone, you have the ability to flip the image. You can take a selfie or you can take a shot regularly looking straight in front of you. That's an example of multiplication. Do you see it? All right, what else can you pick out in cameras? Think about other things related to cameras. Well, in a traditional camera, you have different apertures, and the smartphone has this as well. You can essentially look at 1x, 2x, 3x. You can enlarge or reduce the size of the image you're about to photograph. You can do this with regular cameras by changing the aperture, the f-stop. You turn the focus to change how far away or how close the subject is. That's multiplication. What about modes like panorama or portrait? Those too are examples of the multiplication pattern in photography. And you should be able to look at your smartphone like I am now. I'm looking at my smartphone at the camera function, and I see all these different ways. I have pano. Well, panorama, there's an example of multiplication, right? A panorama scene is one image after another that is just stitched together. And before smartphones that did it for you automatically, people created panoramic views by taking one still image at a time and then stitching them together in what we'll call post-production, right? Back in the darkroom. And they would expose the film and then create one big panorama that you would see with all those separate images now grafted together. That too is an example of multiplication. And today, of course, your camera just does it for you. It's so cool. Even movies, films, videos. Back in the 1800s, 1878, a guy named Edward Muybridge, he did this. He took 24 cameras to photograph a galloping horse. And each of these 24 cameras then captured that image, once again stitched together in the sense of a panorama. But in this case, it looked like the horse was moving. So each camera fired to capture a different state of motion of the horse, and when combined, the horse appeared to be galloping. He created the first moving picture. And here, that simple innovation, that simple example of multiplication created a global billion-dollar industry, really two industries, the film industry as well as entertainment that we have today based on movies. Wow. So multiplication is just so prevalent in the entire world of photography and cameras, starting with the idea of a multiplied image. Okay, now comes the part where you get to think about how to create something completely new to the world. The first part was finding innovations in a camera. Now I'm going to challenge you to actually invent something completely new to the world. Can you do it? All right. Well, I'm going to challenge you to do it, and then I'm going to invite you to email me that invention, not so I can run off and become a billionaire with it, but rather share your ideas here on this podcast. And in a future episode, I'll take the suggestions and inventions from listeners like you and put them out on the air and see what we come up with. Here's the way you're going to invent something completely new to the world using multiplication. Let's take a camera, everyday camera, or if you'd like, you can start with the camera app on your smartphone. It doesn't matter. But what you do is, let's say with a camera, I want you to imagine you are going to list every component of that camera, almost as though you took it apart piece by piece and you picked each one up and you made a list, a numbered list of all the parts of that camera, not down to every little tiny screw, but just the major parts of that camera. Okay, and then once you have that list of components, here's how it works. You are going to randomly pick one of those components. You're going to create a copy of that component, but then you're going to force yourself to change it in some weird, counterintuitive way. Don't have it figured out. You're going to put it somewhere differently, or you're going to make it a different material or different color. I don't care. It doesn't matter how you change it, but change it in some way that honestly doesn't seem to make any sense to you. That's the real power when you use this method. And I'll do an example for you so you can see how this works. And then I'm going to expect you to do it as we discussed before. So let's do this. I'm looking at my camera right here in front of my microphone. I use a Panasonic Lumix S1 camera for my video productions. And as I look at this camera, I see the usual components like the flash, the viewfinder, and different hookups. Okay, so I'm looking at this, and I'm going to pick one of these randomly. I see a cable coming out of the HDMI port. That comes out of my HDMI port and then connects to my production equipment. Let's imagine that I pick this component. And to use multiplication, what I have to do now is imagine making a copy of this component. There's going to be a second HDMI port, but it's going to be different than what I have now. All right, so there's this second HDMI port, and I'm going to imagine it's in a different location. Let's do something really weird and wacky. Let's imagine this thing comes straight out of the lens of the camera. In other words, you're scratching your head, you're thinking, what? This camera now has an HDMI port on the side of it to connect to a computer, but now it has a second HDMI port coming right out of the lens that takes the picture. Hey, I don't know about you, but I definitely picked a weird one. I mean, that sounds absurd. Like, why would you do that? And of course, when you think that way, when you say, oh my God, why would you do that? That's the stupidest idea. When you do that, you're immediately experiencing this condition we call cognitive fixedness, and that's to be expected. But what you have to do to use this method correctly is suspend your disbelief for a minute and just simply ask one question, which is, okay, what would be the benefit? Not that we're going to, but if we did have an HDMI port coming out of the camera lens, are there benefits that we can identify, no matter how absurd it seems? Now, I didn't prepare this ahead of time. I'm actually doing this live in the moment, and I'm going to challenge myself now to invent something, and I want you to think about it too. What would be an advantage if the HDMI port came right out of the camera lens? Well, for one thing, imagine it could attach to another device that's right in front of me. Instead of having to come out the side, it's maybe more locationally efficient or effective if it came out of the lens. The challenge is, of course, would it be picked up in the picture? And let's say it would be picked up in the picture. What if the camera actually was able to photograph not just the subject, but also the data port where that picture is being captured? I know this is weird, but imagine this thing captures the inside of the HDMI port and is going to reflect back the data that's captured. Maybe this is used something like where the camera is hooked up to a piece of equipment and it's going to photograph what that HDMI port is connected to. Wow. Now I'm getting over the top, but this would be a completely new to the world invention, you'd have to admit. So this camera now actually ports out a HDMI cable where the lens is, and it's going to integrate that HDMI image in some way into what it's capturing. This wouldn't be used for family portraits. No, don't get me wrong. I'm suggesting, would this be a new way for this camera to do some sort of diagnostic? Would it be some way to capture other things about whatever is connected to that HDMI port? I don't know. It starts to put out this idea of, can the camera be used for more than just taking images? Can it also be used to see other things than just images like your family or your grandpuppy or your light switch, right? I don't know. That's what I want you to do. That's what I'm going to challenge you to do. And it's that simple. All I did was randomly take a component, copied it, changed it, put it in some weird way that didn't make any sense, and then sought a benefit. And I did that fairly quickly. And I realize I have a lot of experience in this, but I want you to do it now. And don't be bashful. Go ahead and try it. Then email me. Email is very simply drew@drewboyd.com. And give me your suggestions, and we're going to go ahead and see who comes up with the most innovative ideas in a future podcast episode. Thanks for joining us today. If you like this podcast, go ahead and subscribe. If you know somebody that's really into photography, go ahead and send them this episode. Who knows? You or your colleagues may end up finding something that could be of extreme value to this great invention called photography.